All right, so imagine this. Is it really impossible for the past to have gone any other way? Like, what if things had turned out differently? And what
Right.
does it even mean when we say something could have happened when, well, it never did? These questions, they're not just, idle thoughts, right? For
Mm.
us as philosophers, they get right to the core of how we understand, well, time, reality, the whole shebang. That's why we're here today, to take a deep dive. And we've tailored this one specifically for you because we know you're a philosopher who wants to get right into the heart of these complex ideas. No beating around the bush, right? We're getting straight to the good stuff.
And these really aren't new questions. Thinkers have been wrestling with these concepts for ages. We're talking millennia.
Exactly. I mean, today, our guide for this intellectual adventure, well, he's the ancient Greek philosopher Diodorus Cronus. Now, as a philosopher, you've probably come across his name, in discussions of logic or modal theory. But Diodorus, he wasn't just some footnote in history. He was a major intellectual force who tackled fundamental questions about time, possibility, change, you name it. He even looked into language itself. Some of his ideas, they really took root, influencing entire schools of philosophy. And others, well, maybe they haven't gotten as much attention. That's why I think we're in for some real aha moments today.
Yes, and understanding Diodorus gives us this crucial perspective. It's like a window into how Western thought evolved. You see these foundational concepts being debated and refined way back then.
Absolutely. Our main source for this deep dive today is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They've got a fantastic entry on Diodorus Cronus. So our mission, to distill those key insights and give you a really clear and solid understanding of his thought. Because let's be honest, some of his ideas are, well, pretty radical, right? So first things first, who was this Diodorus Cronus and what was the philosophical scene like back then?
Diodorus was born in Iossos, which is in modern-day Turkey. His teacher, Apollonius Cronus, was a major influence on him, and that's actually where he got the nickname Cronus. It might have meant something like respected elder or even shrewd thinker, which, it seems fitting. And it's interesting, Apollonius himself was a student of Eubules of Miletus, who was taught by Euclides of Megara. So Diodorus had these roots, these intellectual roots that went all the way back to the circle of Socrates.
Wow, talk about a philosophical pedigree. So to get a sense of his timeline, when was Diodorus actually active?
He passed away in Alexandria around 284 BCE, and we know he was teaching in Athens during the 310s BCE. Some of his students became major figures in their own right, too. Zeno of Citium, who founded Stoicism, and Philo the logician, they were both his pupils. Even the skeptic Arcesilaus was influenced by him. Later on, it seems like he was part of this really vibrant intellectual community that Ptolemy Soter was putting together in Alexandria.
So he was right in the thick of things, a central figure in his time. Now, I've always heard Diodorus mentioned in connection with the Megaric school. Is that accurate?
It's a point of scholarly debate, actually. He's traditionally linked to the Megarics, the school founded by Euclides of Megara, but the dominant view today is that Diodorus was actually part of a separate school of thought called the dialectical school. You see, our sources consistently refer to him as a dialectician. It's only in later accounts that you see him labeled as a Megaric. Maybe figures like Chrysippus link some of his paradoxes with what they considered Megaric questions, but a separate dialectical school seems more historically accurate.
That's interesting. So sharing some intellectual territory, but not a full-fledged Megaric? And what about Aristotle? Weren't they contemporaries? Did they, directly engage with each other's work?
Yeah, their active periods overlap, but it's very unlikely that Aristotle was directly influenced by Diodorus. Diodorus died in the mid-280s BCE, while Aristotle died in 322 BCE. So even if Diodorus had a long career, their most productive periods wouldn't have coincided much. It's more likely that Diodorus had access to Aristotle's work, all those writings, and he was probably responding to them, maybe challenging some of the established ideas.
So it's more like Diodorus is coming on the scene and maybe grappling with Aristotle's legacy. And that brings us to what's probably his most famous contribution, the one that's made philosophers ponder for centuries.
Yeah.
The master argument. Sounds pretty intimidating. What was it all about?
The master argument, as Epictetus famously described it, presented this apparent conflict between three propositions. Each of them seems plausible on its own, but together they create this tension. First, every past truth is necessary. Second, the impossible can't follow from the possible. And third, there's this possible truth that neither is true nor will be true. Faced with this contradiction, Diodorus chose to deny the third premise.
Let's unpack these for a second. Every past truth is necessary. There's something, intuitively appealing about that, isn't there? As philosophers, once something happens, it feels fixed, unchangeable.
Right. Even Aristotle seemed to agree with this. He even quoted the poet Agathon, who said that even the gods can't make what has happened not have happened. The past, it just has this sense of being settled beyond alteration.
And the second premise, the impossible does not follow from the possible. That seems like, well, a basic principle of logic. If you can derive a contradiction from a set of assumptions, then at least one of those assumptions has to be wrong.
Exactly. If something impossible could come from something possible, then the whole structure of our logical inferences would fall apart.
So it's that third premise that Diodorus had a problem with. There is a possible truth which neither is true nor will be. As a philosopher, what kind of scenario might this be referring to?
Think of a possibility that just never becomes real in the present or the future. Like, imagine a coin flip. It could have landed heads, but it landed tails. And let's say we're never flipping that coin again. This premise is saying that heads was a real possibility, but it never happened, and it never will happen.
And Diodorus said, nope, not buying it.
Yeah.
So what was his alternative? How did he reinterpret possibility after this argument?
He said that any possible truth has to be either true now or true at some point in the future. So going back to that coin flip, if it never lands heads, then Diodorus would say that in that specific flip, it was never really possible for it to land heads.
That's a pretty radical way to redefine possibility, isn't it? It kind of collapses possibility into what's actually true or what will become true. It doesn't seem to leave much room for, those unfulfilled possibilities.
It does, and that's why many see the master argument as leading to fatalism. If the only possibilities are those that are or will be true, then the future seems kind of set in stone, all predetermined. Alexander of Aphrodisias, a later commentator, said that Diodorus's account of possibility was seen as leading to fatalism, even back then.
So if I'm understanding this right, if I'm not a concert pianist right now and I'm never going to become one, then according to Diodorus, it's not just that I'm not a concert pianist, it's that it's impossible for me to have ever been one or to ever become one.
That's the logical consequence, yes.
That's a pretty different way of thinking about potential. Now, you mentioned that the master argument wasn't universally accepted as proof of fatalism. How did other thinkers respond to this dilemma, this trilemma?
Not everyone saw it as a straight path to fatalism. Some saw it more like a logical puzzle, a paradox that needed untangling. Diodorus denying the third premise, that was just one approach. We know that the dialectician Panthoides, he rejected the first premise, that every past truth is necessary. And Chrysippus, the Stoic logician, supposedly rejected the second premise. He thought maybe the impossible could follow from the possible in certain situations. So there were all these attempts to sort of figure out this really knotty argument.
It's amazing to see those different lines of logical resistance to Diodorus' conclusion. You mentioned some antecedents to the master argument in Aristotle's work. Where can we find those echoes?
In his Metaphysics, Aristotle talks about the views of the Megarics and other thinkers who were concerned with potentiality, with capacity. He attributes to them the view that something is only possible, only has a capacity, when it's actually being exercised. So a builder can only build when they're actually building, that sort of thing. This view, we can call it M0, shares a similarity with Diodorus. They're both a little skeptical of, mere possibilities, those unactualized possibilities, like that idea in MA3.
So there's this shared intuition, this reluctance to give too much weight to possibilities that don't materialize. But you also mentioned some important differences between the Megaric view and Diodorus' account of possibility.
Yes, there are some key differences. First, M0 is all about the capacities of individuals, like that builder can build. Diodorus' view, which we'll call D, is framed in terms of the truth of propositions, like a proposition P is possible. Second, M0 is presented as a one-way conditional only when, but D is an equivalence if and only if. And third, D includes this disjunction. Possibility means being true or will be true. M0 is just focused on what's actual right now.
Those are some significant shifts in how they're thinking about possibility. What might have driven those changes?
We can speculate a bit. Maybe Diodorus, perhaps influenced by Aristotle, thought that modal truths were ultimately based on facts about individuals and their capabilities. So moving to a propositional formulation was a natural progression. Plus, Diodorus himself was a big figure in propositional logic, so focusing on propositions would align with his broader interests. The shift to an equivalence probably reflects the idea that if something is true, then it's definitely possible. That seems pretty straightforward.
And the third difference, that inclusion of future truth in Diodorus' definition. You said Aristotle criticized the Megaric view for seemingly wiping out the possibility of change altogether. How does Diodorus' account address that?
Well, Aristotle argued that if possibility is strictly tied to what's happening now, then let's say someone who's sitting couldn't possibly stand up because they're not standing right now. That leads to this weird conclusion that they could never stand up, denying the possibility of change. Diodorus's disjunctive account, though possible if true or will be true, that offers a way out. Even if someone sitting can't stand at this very moment, according to the Megarics, it doesn't mean, on Diodorus's view, that they can't stand up later. As long as they will stand up at some point, it's possible for them to stand.
That's clever. So it's like Diodorus is taking that Magiric intuition and refining it, trying to work around some of the more obvious objections, especially about change, but still keeping that skepticism about possibilities that never actually happen. Let's go back to the premises of the master argument. We've talked about MA1. How about MA2, that the impossible does not follow from the possible? What was Diodorus thinking there?
It's likely that Diodorus understood this premise in a way that's similar to Aristotle's test for possibility that we find in the Metaphysics. Aristotle says that one way to test if something's possible is to hypothetically assume it's actually true. If that doesn't lead to any contradictions, then the original proposition is, in fact, possible. MA2 is sort of like that test, but in reverse. If assuming a proposition is possible leads to something impossible, then that original proposition couldn't have been possible to begin with. It highlights how important it is to have a consistent background of truths when we're talking about possibility.
Okay, that helps us grasp the logical framework a bit better. Now let's delve deeper into this idea of fate and Diodorus's modal system. We've seen how his definition of possibility seems to point toward a future that's already determined. How does this tie into the philosophical concept of fatalism?
Because Diodorus's definition of possibility, it's possible if it's true or will be true, it rules out those what-if possibilities, the counterfactuals. So it naturally leans towards a deterministic view of fate. If anything that won't happen is considered impossible, then the future is already set. It's like a single, unchangeable path. Alexander of Ephesus was pretty clear about this. For him to be in Corinth, it's only possible if he's either there now or will be there at some point in the future. If he never goes, it was never possible for him to be there.
So the future isn't a branching tree of possibilities, but more like a script that's already written.
That's the implication. We can formalize Diodorian possibility like this. A proposition P is possible if and only if P is true right now, or there's some future time when P will be true, is often written as P or FP. And from that basic definition, we can get his understanding of necessity, which is that something is true now and will be true at all future times, and contingency, which is that something is either not true now but will be true in the future, or true now but won't be true in the future.
Now, a big question for any philosopher. Does this system allow for what we call future contingents? Can there be events in the future whose outcome is genuinely open?
That's a major point of debate when it comes to interpreting Diodorus. Nicholas Danier, he's argued that Diodorus' system does allow for a kind of future contingency, at least asynchronously. For instance, it could be contingent tomorrow whether Alexander is in Corinth, if he's not there tomorrow but will be there the day after. He even suggests a limited synchronous future contingency. But Suzanne Bobzian, she makes a strong counter-argument. She says that Diodorus' system is fundamentally deterministic because it doesn't allow for simultaneous possibilities for a single event at the same time. In her view, at any given moment, the truth value of a future event, like will Dio be walking at noon tomorrow, that's already decided. You can't have both possibilities at the same time.
That's an important point. So even if there are future events that haven't happened yet, their outcome is already fixed right now.
That's Bobzian's take. But Diodorus believed in temporal atomism, the idea that time is made up of these discrete, indivisible units, no continuous flow. And that might offer a way to address Bobzian's concerns about determinacy in the present. He could say that at any single atomic moment in the present, the proposition, Dio is walking at the next atomic moment, that has a definite truth value. But at the current atomic moment, both Dio will walk at the next atomic moment and Dio will not walk at the next atomic moment. Those could be considered possible because one of them will become true in the very next moment.
So the contingency isn't within a single moment, but in that transition between those discrete moments. That hinges on time being discrete, though. What if time is dense, infinitely divisible?
Then this argument loses a lot of its force. If time is dense, then between any two moments you can always find another moment. That makes it really hard to pinpoint when exactly a transition or a change happens, like we were talking about earlier with someone starting or stopping an action.
So temporal atomism seems pretty crucial if Diodorus wants to reconcile his modal system with any kind of future contingency. Now, what does this all mean for free will? If everything's either necessary or will be, Does that leave any room for us to make choices freely?
Diodorus's view definitely poses a problem for libertarian ideas of free will. Those usually require a genuine ability to choose between different equally possible options, the could do otherwise condition, but it might work with certain compatibilist views. They try to reconcile determinism with the feeling that we have free will by rejecting that could do otherwise requirement. They say even if what will happen is already set, our actions can still be free if they come from our desires, intentions, our own reasoning.
That's an important distinction. Determinism doesn't automatically equal no agency at all. And you mentioned how Diodorian modality relates to the classic lazy argument. What's that all about?
The lazy argument basically says that if fate decides everything, then why bother doing anything? Whatever's going to happen will happen, right? But Diodorus' system, while deterministic, it still gives us a reason to act. The final outcome, like whether you pass an exam, that's determined once it happens, but we don't know the future yet. So our actions, like studying hard, they're how that predetermined outcome, passing or failing, actually happens. In a way, it's kind of comforting. Do your best, but once something's happened, there's no point in dwelling on it. It couldn't have been any other way.
So it's like engage actively, accept the outcome.
Interesting. Let's move to logic now. You said Diodorus was involved in some heated debates about conditional statements. What were his ideas about if-then constructions?
We know about Diodorus' theory of conditionals mostly from Sextus Empiricus. He talked about four major views on conditionals back then, including those of Philo and Diodorus. Philo defined a conditional as being true in all cases, except when it has a true antecedent and a false consequent. That's basically material implication in modern logic. So something like, if it's raining, then the ground is wet. That's only false if it actually is raining, but the ground's somehow dry.
Exactly. But Diodorus's definition was much stricter. He said a conditional is true only if it neither could nor can begin from truth and end in falsehood.
That's way more demanding than Philo's view.
It is. Some people initially thought Diodorus was getting at strict implication, where the antecedent necessitates the consequent in all possible worlds. But that view has been largely rejected. The most accepted interpretation now is that a Diodorian conditional is true only if the corresponding material conditional is true at all times. So if I say, if it's day, then I am conversing, that would be false for Diodorus if there ever was or ever will be a time when it's daytime, but I'm not talking. This is what's called the all-time conditional.
I see. The connection between the antecedent and the consequent has to hold true throughout all of time. But you said there are some issues with this all-time interpretation.
Yes, a couple things. First, ancient propositions were often tensed. They referred to specific times, whereas the material conditional is usually tenseless. A bigger issue is that the all-time reading seems to make part of Diodorus's definition redundant. If a conditional neither was possible nor is possible, that antecedent is true and consequent is false, then the all-time condition already covers that. You don't need to mention the future specifically. Plus, if something is true at all times, it would probably be considered necessary in Diodorus' system. That could make his conditional the same as strict implication, which many scholars believe was stronger than what he intended. Some suggest that he was trying to create a conditional that was stronger than Philo's, but still flexible enough to work with different ideas about possibility.
So it's a subtle and still debated point. The main takeaway is that Diodorus had a much stricter view on when a conditional statement could be considered true. All right, his ontology. He had some unique ideas about the basic building blocks of reality, right? Something about simples.
Yeah, Diodorus believed that the most basic, indivisible elements of bodies, time, and space were these things he called simples, which in Greek is amero, meaning partless. He saw these simples as being not just physically indivisible, but also metaphysically simple. They have no parts, no internal complexity. That's different from, say, Epicurus's atoms. Diodorus also seems to have believed in indivisible minimum units of time and space. How committed he was to time atomism, that's still debated, but the general consensus is that he was on board with it.
So reality, at its most fundamental level, is made up of these tiny, irreducible bits, both in space and time.
That's the picture. These simples have properties like location, a tiny bit of extension. They're very small, and we can't perceive them with our senses. They also have relational properties. A simple body takes up a simple space. It exists at a simple moment in time, and you can order these simple spaces and times. And crucially, these simples combine to form complex things, and they're considered the fundamental principles, or archai, from which those complexes come about.
Why did Diodorus go for this atomistic view? What problems was he trying to solve?
We don't have any direct texts from Diodorus explaining his reasons for atomism, so any explanation is going to be a bit speculative. Some think there's a connection to his unique definition of possibility. The thinking goes, if nothing can be divided infinitely, either now or in the future, which fits with his modal views, then it follows that it's not possible for anything to be infinitely divided, so there must be a fundamental level of indivisible simples. However, Nicholas Denyer argues against this being the main reason. He points out that this argument wouldn't necessarily guarantee that all simples are the same size. And Denyer thinks, based on their partlessness, that all Diodorian simples must be the same size. If two simples were different sizes, the smaller one could be seen as a part of the larger one, and that would contradict the whole idea of them being partless.
That's a subtle but important point about the consistency of the simples. You also mentioned Denyer suggests that Diodorus's arguments against motion and change could be a more direct reason for his atomism.
That's a possibility. But the problem is that Diodorus's arguments against motion and change often seem to assume the existence of atoms and minimum units of space and time. So if we use those arguments as the primary justification for atomism, we might end up with circular reasoning.
It's like a philosophical chicken or egg problem.
Hmm.
Now, about change. Diodorus had this very distinct and kind of paradoxical stance. He denied that change happens in the present, but accepted that change happened in the past. That sounds like a contradiction.
It does sound contradictory, and it's something that's been discussed and debated a lot by scholars. Let's start with his arguments against present change. The traditional view is that he was responding to Zeno's famous paradoxes of motion. Maybe he saw simples as a way to avoid the problem of infinite divisibility, but then argued that even with these fundamental units, motion in the present moment is impossible. But more recent scholarship suggests that Diodorus's denial might have been broader, encompassing not just motion, but also qualitative and existential change in the present, and applying to both simples and the complex things they make up.
Can you give an example of his argument against present change, especially for these fundamental simples?
Sextus Empiricus describes an argument based on the relationship between a simple body, which is partless, and the simple place it occupies, which is also partless. Diodorus argued that a simple body can't move within the place it's in because it fills that space perfectly. To move, you need a space that's bigger than the thing moving, and it can't move into a place it doesn't occupy because it's not there yet to start the movement. So the argument concludes, a simple body can't move at all in the present.
So this argument depends on the idea that a simple body and the place it's in are exactly the same size, perfectly matched. What was the reasoning behind that claim?
Nicholas Denyer offers a good explanation. He argues that if two partless simples were different sizes, then the smaller one would have to be the same size as a part of the larger simple. And that goes against the basic idea that they're both partless. Therefore, all simple bodies must occupy simple places that are exactly the same size, however small that might be.
Interesting. So if the building blocks of reality are these perfectly fitting, unchanging simples in the present, how did Diodorus explain the fact that we obviously experience change happening around us all the time?
That's where his acceptance of past change comes in. He argued that we can see a body in one place at one time and then see that same body in a different place at a later time. That observation, he said, logically means that the body must have moved between those two times.
But didn't Sextus object to this, saying that statements about the past imply corresponding statements about the present? If something was somewhere, doesn't that mean something about the present moment as well?
Sextus did object to that. He argued that if it has been the case that a body was at place Y, then it is currently the case that at some earlier time it was at place Y. But Diodorus countered with examples of what we might call relational change. He famously used the example of Helen having 3 husbands. The statement, Helen had 3 husbands, is true about the past, but it doesn't mean that at any single point in time the statement Helen has 3 husbands was true. She had them one after the other at different times. Similarly, he would argue that the statement Achilles moved is true because he was in different places at different atomic moments, but it was never true that Achilles is moving at any single indivisible moment. This fits perfectly with his atomistic view of time. Change happens as a series of different states or relations at different moments, not as a continuous process within a single present moment.
So change is real for Diodorus, but it's basically a historical thing, a sequence of different configurations across time, not something that actually unfolds within any present moment. That's a really fascinating way to try and square those seemingly contradictory positions. Now, onto his philosophy of language. I know he was concerned about ambiguity in philosophical arguments.
Yes, the problem of ambiguity was a big deal for Plato and other early Socratic thinkers. It could undermine the possibility of meaningful philosophical dialogue. If two people are using the same term but mean different things, they might think they disagree when they're actually talking about totally different concepts. Diodorus, as a skilled dialectician, would have been very aware of this potential for confusion.
What was his solution to this problem of ambiguity? I remember hearing that he had a pretty extreme view on it.
He's sometimes said to have a kind of Humpty Dumpty view, that words mean whatever the speaker wants them to mean. But the evidence suggests a more nuanced and actually more rigid position. Diodorus seems to have believed that no term is inherently ambiguous. Every word, when used correctly, has just one clear meaning. He seems to have argued that we don't speak or even think anything ambiguous, and we always express exactly what we intend to.
But don't we often have ambiguous thoughts?
Mhm.
Or accidentally say something we don't mean? Like using a word thinking it means one thing, but it actually means something else.
Exactly. Those are the kinds of objections that have been raised against his seemingly strong view on the singular meaning of words. Plato, for instance, famously questioned whether our thoughts themselves could sometimes be, well, indeterminate. Diodorus might have responded by saying that for a thought to be effective, to communicate, it needs to be determinate, focused on a single object or concept. His view seems to be that the speaker's intention plays a major role in fixing the meaning of a word.
That connects to his views on naming, right? He did some pretty unusual things when it came to giving names.
Yeah, Diodorus is known for advocating a radical form of conventionalism when it came to naming. He seems to have thought that names are just arbitrary labels assigned by convention, and that the speaker's intention is what really matters. A good example of this is how he named his slaves after logical particles like however and on the one hand, which were terms used in arguments. And he famously gave his daughter a masculine name, Theognis. He probably did these things to challenge the idea that there's some natural connection between a name and the thing it names, or, in the case of nouns, a natural grammatical gender.
So these were almost like philosophical experiments in his own life, making a point about language.
Exactly. He was likely engaging with and maybe provoking the debates of his time about how words relate to the world. Was it based in nature or purely human convention?
And finally, Diodorus is also associated with some famous logical paradoxes, right? The veiled paradox and the horns paradox.
Right. Some sources say Eubulides of Miletus came up with them, but Diogenes Laertius specifically mentions that some people credited Diodorus as their originator, or at least as a key figure in discussing them. These paradoxes are really interesting because they highlight challenges within the structure of question and answer dialectic.
Can you remind us what those paradoxes are?
The horns paradox usually goes like this.
Yeah.
What you haven't lost, you still have. You haven't lost horns, therefore you still have horns. It's a paradox because the premise you haven't lost horns seems true for someone who never had horns, but the conclusion is clearly false. The veiled paradox often involves someone saying they know their father, but then denying they know a veiled man who's later revealed to be their father. This leads to the conclusion that they both know and don't know their father, which seems contradictory.
So they're basically traps, meant to expose problems in our reasoning. How do Diodorus's views on ambiguity connect to how these paradoxes might be solved?
His insistence that no term is truly ambiguous and that every sentence expresses just one clear proposition could be the key to resolving them. The veiled paradox, for example, relies on the fact that two different terms, your father and this veiled man, can refer to the same person without the listener realizing it. If each term has just one meaning, fixed by the speaker's intention and the context, then the ambiguity that creates the paradox is gone. Similarly, the horns paradox hinges on a false assumption in the question itself that the person had horns at some point. If every question has to express a single, unambiguous proposition, then questions based on false assumptions would be seen as problematic within his framework.
It's amazing how all these pieces of his philosophy fit together. The master argument shaping his view of possibility, which might then connect to his atomism and his denial of present change, and even his philosophy of language, all aimed at ensuring clarity and precision in reasoning.
And that's what's so fascinating for us as philosophers. It's all interconnected. Scholars have often looked at individual parts of Diodorus's thought in isolation, but when we consider it all together, we start to see a coherent, although sometimes quite challenging worldview. He wasn't just playing with logical puzzles. He was building a whole system grounded in fundamental principles.
He really was. He took seemingly simple premises, some of which even his philosophical rivals, including Aristotle, might have agreed with, and pushed them to these radical conclusions. It makes you rethink those core philosophical concepts that we still grapple with today.
Exactly. His skepticism towards unactualized possibilities, his atomistic view of reality, his denial of present change, it's all part of a truly unique and enduring philosophical vision.